The Buddha I am, Gautama, is my name. I would like to take this opportunity to talk about some topics that may not seem to be saying anything about Korea, but perhaps in not saying anything about Korea, I shall nevertheless be saying something about Korea for those who are able to grasp it. If you study the magnificent discourse given by Jesus on the path to Christhood, you will see, my beloved, that there are certain stages of this path. And especially when you approach and go beyond the 96th level, then there will be some challenges that you will be facing, that you will have to deal with. There's like an echo in the microphone, like a feedback. You don't hear it? Okay. It's just like there's a singing sound that comes back when I speak loud. Okay, maybe it's better now. There are some challenges you will have to deal with in order to climb higher towards the 144th level. We can consider these challenges as certain paradoxes, as certain enigmas that you will need to resolve before you can rise to a higher level of the path. There are a number of these enigmas, and I will not go into all of them, but I will comment on some of them. Now you see, my beloved, when we of the Ascended Masters approach unascended humankind and attempt to give you a teaching, then we face a very specific challenge that few people in embodiment have understood. The fact of the matter is that when you are an Ascended Master, you have transcended the linear, dualistic, analytical mind. Therefore, you have a more spherical awareness. You do not see everything through this filter of polarities, of extremes, of value judgments and a value scale. You do not have a linear mind that compares one statement to another and perhaps sees a contradiction because the two do not seem to be saying the same. We know, of course, that people who are unascended are indeed in this state of mind, of very easily seeing contradictions because they interpret everything with a linear mind. They think they have to take this statement literally, they think they have to take that statement literally, and when you take two statements literally, they seem to be in contradiction. Now, my beloved, there are many spiritual students who have begun to study spiritual, or for that matter, religious teachings, and then they have seen what they perceive to be contradictions. Many in the Western world have used the seeming contradictions of religious scriptures to reason with science or materialism that all religion is made up and that none of it really makes sense. This, of course, is the extreme outcome of using this linear mind. But even many religious or spiritual people do find contradictions, often between two different spiritual teachings, and this makes them think they have to choose that one of them is right and the other one is wrong. There are even those who begin to see contradictions within one spiritual teaching, and it confuses them. It even causes some to give up on the path. So, my purpose here is to give you some remarks that can help you get beyond this stage, for it is indeed a stage on the path where you are actually, in a certain sense, you have risen above the linear mind, but you have not consciously broken through and freed your conscious mind from the linear way of thinking. You have not consciously seen the limitations of the linear way of thinking. And therefore, you can still be disturbed by these seeming contradictions. So at a very general level, my beloved, I can tell you that, of course, there can be certain instances where there may be statements that are contradictory. We cannot, when we bring forth a teaching through an undescended messenger, guarantee that there cannot be certain errors that creep in, and there might be a few contradictions here and there. But when you come to a more mature level of the path, you will not let one error or one contradiction cause you to reject their part of the teaching that is still valid. That having been said, in the vast majority of cases, what seems like a contradiction only seems like a contradiction because it is viewed through the filter of the linear mind. So, the constructive response when you see a contradiction is to say, I need to raise my consciousness so I can gain a higher perspective on the issue. There must be something I have not seen, something I have not understood, and when I see it, it will resolve what right now seems like a contradiction. Then you open yourself up to direct intuitive guidance from the Ascended Masters, from your I Am Presence, from your Christ Self, to resolve the enigma. Or you study further teachings because you realize there may be other teachings that could help you resolve the enigma. And so, as one example of what many people have seen as contradictory, you can take the mission of the Buddha itself. I taught, even 2,500 years ago, that the goal of my teaching was to give you a path that could help you rise above the normal state of consciousness by attaining complete non-attachment. Yet, my beloved, if I personally had achieved complete non-attachment, why would I bother to teach? In other words, many people interpret the concept of non-attachment to mean that you do not care what happens on earth. So they reason that if the Buddha truly had non-attachment, he should not care what happened to other people, so why bother to go out and give them a teaching that might help them escape the wheel of suffering? Why would the Buddha not simply be non-attached and move on, leaving people to make the same discovery he had made, and thereby free themselves if they could, and if they could not, leave them to continue on the wheel of rebirth, suffering, until they had finally had enough and awakened themselves. But you see, my beloved, non-attachment is not the same as not caring. It is, however, not a caring that is a human caring. It is not based on fear. It is not based on wanting to force other people or wanting to force a change in the world. The fact that you are non-attached does not mean that you will choose to do nothing. It means that you might choose to do something to help others, or you can choose to move on. But if you choose to help others, you are not coming from the human level of wanting to see a specific result. You are actually not teaching for a specific purpose. You are not seeking to achieve a specific result from your teaching. You are teaching because you want to share what you have discovered. You want to share who you are. You are therefore not seeking to force others. You are offering them an alternative to the prevalent state of consciousness on earth. There are those for whom this will seem like a subtle, perhaps even nonsensical distinction. This, I recognize, is the case. I cannot help you resolve these paradoxes if you are not at the level where you are willing to do what I just described and raise your consciousness. If you are always projecting out that the problem is out there, that the problem is with the teaching or the teacher, then you cannot resolve these paradoxes. You will then have to enter the school of hard knocks and receive sufficient number of knocks until you become willing to say, perhaps it is me that needs to change. Perhaps the block is in my consciousness rather than being a fault with the teacher or the teaching or other people or the world. And so, some of you might know the story told about my life that after I had qualified for Buddhahood, after I had entered Nirvana and considered going out of Nirvana in order to teach, I was confronted with the entire force of this world saying that there was no point in me going out and teaching because the state of consciousness I had reached was so fundamentally different from the state of consciousness that all people are in, that there was no way they could understand or grasp my teaching. In other words, it could not make a difference. My response to this was, some will understand. And during the past 2,500 years, some have understood, but only a few. We are, however, now at a point in time where many more are ready to understand. And that is, of course, why I now present myself as an Ascended Master, as one among many Ascended Masters, and attempt to give you a teaching that is adapted to the modern age. Again, before I decided to do this, I again had to face this force that is not a conscious being, but it is simply that when you as Ascended Master consider what you can do for unascended mankind, you need to tune in to where mankind is at in consciousness. And then you are confronted with the difference between the collective consciousness and your own state of consciousness. And there is a certain moment where you feel the impossibility of bridging the gap. And therefore you have to deal with that. You have to, in your mind, find a way around it so that you look at where people are at in consciousness and you consider ways of helping them rise above that and tune into some aspect of your presence, your being. And so, this dictation is one expression of this, as all of my other dictations have been, and as all dictations from Ascended Masters are. And so what I'm seeking here is to help you see the limitations of the linear mind, because the linear, rational, analytical mind is indeed much more dominant in today's world than it was 2,500 years ago. And so, I would like to give you another example. One of the concepts I gave to the world back then was the concept that when you walk the Eightfold Path, you can attain a higher state of consciousness that I called enlightenment. Now, I attempted back then to tell people how to attain enlightenment and how to avoid having the concept of enlightenment block their enlightenment. But very few people have understood this, and especially in the modern age, very few people have grasped it precisely because of the influence of the linear mind. You see, my beloved, we have given you the concept of a spiritual path. We have talked about the 144 levels of consciousness, of how you can consciously begin the path at the 48th level, and you can plot your course as you rise up towards the 96th level, where you can follow a series of logical steps that take you in a linear process of gradually raising your consciousness. We have also told you that you can go beyond the 96th level, and you again go up through a series of steps until you reach the 144th level. And this is, of course, a linear process. But the spiritual path, or the process of attaining enlightenment, does not have to be described in a linear fashion. It could also be described in a spherical fashion. It is simply that what we give you in this age is adapted to the fact that you have a linear thinking. We, of course, also adapt our teachings in such a way, design them in such a way, that you will gradually escape the blindness of the linear mind and come to see beyond it by daring to follow your intuition, which is not linear. Yet, I still want to express some idea here about this concept of enlightenment. In order to fully understand this, we need to step back a little bit. I attempted to give this teaching 2,500 years ago, but it was actually more difficult to give it back then, and ironically, you might say, it was more difficult because people did not think in such a linear way back then as they do now. And so, it is not so, my beloved, that it was better or that people were more open to a spiritual teaching back then than they are today. It is not that I am trying to say here that the development of the linear mind has been a backward step. It is only a backward step when it is taken to the extreme. But the development of the linear mind in its higher form is indeed designed by the Ascended Masters because it is a logical step up from the kind of more mythological, magical thinking that people were in before the modern age. And so, precisely because you have a more linear mind, it is actually possible to give you a new perspective on what enlightenment is and how your concept of enlightenment can block the enlightenment. You have, in a modern mindset, this concept of understanding something. And you have the idea that there is a lower level of understanding where you do not have enough knowledge and insight. Then you can follow a process of gaining greater and greater understanding and insight until you see something that you cannot see when you do not have the more advanced knowledge. And this has actually made it easier for us to present a logical path where we can make people lock into the desire they have to progress, and we can give them a very gradual step-by-step process for progressing in their knowledge and understanding of the spiritual side to life. Yet what you also can understand here, even with a linear mind, is that there are levels of understanding. This is easy to see, as I said, a few hundred years ago, even scientists had a far more simple and primitive understanding of the material universe than they have today. And today they have a more sophisticated, more detailed, more in-depth understanding. So you see that there is a progression here. But what you can switch to understand with a linear mind is that it is not so that advancing your knowledge can be done in only one way or within one system. As a simple example of this, my beloved, you can take the concept of atoms. All matter is made of atoms, and even atoms are made of smaller parts called elementary particles. I have just described this knowledge to you in very simple terms, but it took scientists centuries to develop this knowledge. Now, I have just described this knowledge to you in a language called English. But you could also describe the same knowledge in a language called Korean, or Chinese, or French, or any other language. It is the same knowledge, but it is expressed with different words. You can also see with a linear mind that science in general is attempting to describe how the material universe works. But there is not just one branch of science. You have, for example, physics, and you have chemistry. When you take a physical perspective on how matter works, you describe the workings of matter in one way. When you take a chemical perspective, you describe it in another way. It is not that these two are mutually exclusive or incompatible. There are different ways to describe essentially the same phenomenon. Then you can look a little broader and see that what you call life on Earth is more than just physical matter. There's also what you call biological life. And this is described by the science of biology. It is not that biology is incompatible with physics or chemistry. It is perhaps looking at slightly different phenomena, but it is mainly describing life in a different way. Then you can go even beyond this and see that many of the physical sciences are attempting to express their findings in the language of mathematics. So now you see that there is an everyday language that human beings use to communicate in their everyday lives, and there is a mathematical language that scientists use to describe certain phenomena that are beyond what you deal with in your normal life. You cannot really say that the language of mathematics is incompatible with everyday language. They are two different ways to describe, in many cases, the same phenomena. But of course, mathematics can describe certain phenomena or describe them with greater precision than everyday language. On the other hand, my beloved, everyday language is very useful for many practical applications. As a silly example, my beloved, try to go into McDonald's and order a hamburger by using a mathematical formula. And who knows what you will get. And so, you see here that with the linear mind that people have today, it is actually possible to see that the different branches of science are parallel ways to describe the same phenomenon. You even have the concept developed by some people based on the findings of science that there are parallel realities, parallel universes, parallel dimensions that might exist inside each other. You have now the most advanced branch of physics called string theory, which talks about these tiny vibrating strings that exist in 11 dimensions. And so you're beginning to see that even the linear mind can be used to expand people's understanding of spiritual concepts when you realize that a spiritual teaching, not necessarily a doctrinal religion, but a more universal spiritual teaching, is simply a language. It is not just a language of words, but a language of concepts. When science describes a certain phenomenon as a vibrating string, and a spiritual teaching describes it as an elemental being, these are not incompatible descriptions, but parallel descriptions of the same phenomenon. This may not be acceptable to science, but those who are open to a spiritual teaching can see here that there can be different ways of describing the same phenomenon. And some ways cause you to focus on certain aspects of the phenomena, and others cause you to focus on other aspects. Now, I set out this long discourse saying I would explain how giving you the concept of enlightenment can block your enlightenment. And we now need to take my remarks to the point where we realize that as physics describes matter in one way and chemistry in another, and a spiritual teaching can describe it in a third way, what all of these teachings have in common is, my beloved, that they give you a concept that your mind can use to create an internal image of the phenomenon. You cannot, with your physical eyes, see an atom. So when you read the description of atoms given by physics, that description does not give you a direct experience of the atom. It enables you to create a mental image of the atom. Now, this mental image can be useful because it can give you the sense that you understand the phenomenon. It can also be useful in practical terms, in the sense that it can allow you to do something in your everyday life. Why is it, for example, that the modern world has created a much more comfortable material lifestyle where people are on a routine basis doing things that people could not even dream of doing 1,000 years ago? It is because as the linear mind has developed and as the scientific mindset has given you a certain understanding of the world, you have become able to solve problems that could not be solved with the understanding people had 500 or 1,000 years ago. So this has been useful because you can do something in the practical world, and therefore you can create a better standard of living for yourself and for most people. It is for this reason that Saint Germain has sponsored so much technology that is based on the knowledge of science. It has enabled people to create a more comfortable form of living where they actually can have their minds freed to pursue the spiritual side of life instead of having all of their energy consumed by making a living. And so, my beloved, this is a positive development, clearly. But everything in the material universe, at least as long as so many people are trapped in the sense of separation, the consciousness of duality, has a price. There's always a downside, as they say. And the downside is that people can become so attached to these scientific concepts that they cannot see that the concept that is describing the phenomenon is not the same as the phenomenon. And this has one very important limitation. For many people in the modern world, they have lost the idea that at least some people had, but only a few people had in previous times, that the mind has abilities that are beyond the linear analytical aspect of the mind. What we have told you in our teachings is that consciousness always comes before the physical manifestation. So, for every physical phenomenon that exists in the material world, there is a certain matrix of consciousness that exists in the identity, mental, and emotional realms. Your outer mind, your physical senses, the part of the mind that is so tied to the physical senses, can only experience the material phenomenon, not the consciousness behind it. But there are other aspects of your mind that have the potential to experience the consciousness behind any physical phenomenon. And when you experience that consciousness, you gain a more direct experience of the totality of the phenomenon. Now this does not mean, my beloved, that you do not need the linear understanding. For in order to live your lives in practical everyday situations, you need to have that linear understanding. But it is important for you to realize as spiritual students that when we, even as ascended masters, give you a concept about some spiritual phenomenon, your linear mind will immediately create an internal image of the phenomenon. This is what Jesus described in a different way in his dictation about Christhood, where he said that when you are at the 48th level of consciousness, you form a certain concept of what Christhood is, but it cannot be the fullness of Christhood. And therefore you cannot rise to the higher levels of Christhood unless you are willing to look beyond your present concept of Christhood and experience a higher reality. He also said that when you go beyond the 96th level, you are no longer so concerned about understanding with a linear mind, but more concerned about experiencing. And so it is exactly the same with enlightenment. When I gave the concept of enlightenment, I attempted to express this, and I knew that few people would understand it. But you see, my beloved, the concept of enlightenment is just that, a concept. And for all people who are at a lower state of consciousness, it can only be a concept. They form a mental image of what it means to be enlightened. They want to set up some external criteria. They want to set up an automatic mechanical path that says, if I follow these steps and do everything that has been described exactly as it was described, then I should automatically end up being enlightened. And when I am enlightened, when a person is enlightened, that person has this characteristic and that characteristic, and a person behaves like this, does not behave like that, it speaks like this, it does not speak like that, and so forth and so on. This is what the linear mind wants to do. So, my beloved, does this mean the linear mind is not useful on the spiritual path? Of course not. As Jesus also described, there is a certain point where you need to follow a very linear, logical path. And it can be very, very useful for people who become aware that life has a spiritual side, to be presented with a linear path where they go through certain stages, certain progressive initiations that gradually raise their consciousness. And the linear path does raise your consciousness. But a linear path where you keep taking one step at a time can only take you to a certain level. It can take you beyond the 96th level. But my beloved, listen carefully. We have said there are 144 levels of consciousness. So logically, when you come to the 139th level of consciousness, you need to take one step up and you are at the 140th level. And you take another step and you are at 141st level, and so on. But you see, my beloved, the strict linearity that you saw between the 48th and the 96th level becomes less and less important as you go beyond the 96th level. It is as if the concept of a path becomes less important to you. You are not so focused on evaluating what level am I at, what initiation do I need to pass in order to take the next level up, what are the characteristics of a person at that level. You simply are not so concerned about where you are at, because now, instead of being focused on the single steps, you are focused on the process. It is, as we might say, instead of being focused on still images of the river, you are focused on the movement of the river, the process itself. And so my point is that as long as you in your mind have the concept of a path that will lead you step by step to nirvana or to enlightenment, then you will never reach the goal. It may seem contradictory that I'm telling you that in order to reach enlightenment you have to follow a gradual path, but that in order, as long as you have the concept of this path, you cannot reach enlightenment. But the reason for this, my beloved, is that enlightenment is not a linear phenomenon. It is not a physical phenomenon. It is not even a state of consciousness. It is not so that you can say that at the 143rd level you are not enlightened, but at the 144th level you are. There is actually a lower stage where at a point above the 98th level you reach a state that you can call enlightenment, because now you understand that the only thing that really matters is that you free your mind from all of the concepts it has that are based on the conditions in this world. And that is when you also realize that your concept of enlightenment is just that, a concept, not an experience. And therefore you can switch your mind so that instead of striving to fulfill the criteria defined by your concept of enlightenment, you are free of the image, free of the concept, and therefore you experience what I called enlightenment, a different perspective, where your mind is not identified with its own concepts of material phenomena. There are certain phenomena in the material world that were not exclusively created by your mind. As we have said before, all material phenomena are created by a mind, originally created by the minds of the Elohim, but then since humankind started embodying on the planet, humankind has co-created certain phenomena that exist today. Yet, while you are still at the lower levels of consciousness, you are not experiencing the material world as it is. You are experiencing it through the concepts of the mind, the concepts you have created in your mind. So, while your mind, your individual mind, has not created the material phenomena, it has created your images, your concepts of those phenomena, what they are, how they work, what you can do with them, what you can't do with them. In other words, your mind is defining how you see the material world's ability to limit your mind. You understand, my beloved? There are certain material phenomena, but what limits you is not so much the material phenomena as the images the concepts in your mind. And so, the path of attaining what we have called mastery of mind over matter is freeing your mind from the concepts created by the mind that limit your direct experience of matter. The enlightened state is not a state of perfection. It is not even a final state. It is possible to receive what I, as the Buddha, termed enlightenment and still not be at the 144th level. Still have levels of enlightenment to go through before you ascend. But the, so to speak, lowest level of enlightenment is where you stop identifying yourself with the images of and concepts that your own mind has created. You become aware that everything you have in your mind that relates to the material world, and for that matter, most of what you have in your mind that relates to the spiritual world, is just concepts created by the mind. And by becoming non-attached to these concepts, non-attached to these images, by not identifying yourself with the images, you can free your mind from the limitations defined by those images. Many of you have accepted these very subtle images that your mind cannot change matter. As long as you believe in, identify with, as long as you are attached to these images, then your mind cannot change matter. But when you free your mind from these images, then your mind can begin to change matter, because then your mind begins to see that the physical phenomenon is an expression of the matrices of consciousness in the 3 higher levels, and your mind does have the ability to influence these consciousness matrices. And so therefore, your mind is not trapped by the phenomena, and it is not trapped by your images of these phenomena. And so this ties in with what I started out with saying. Because you could look at a contradiction or a seeming contradiction in even the teachings we have given you at these 2 conferences. For example, you have all of these dictations by the masters who pointed out to you that here is a particular issue in your society that you need to make the calls on in your invocations, so that you invoke light from the ascended masters, and so that the masters can step in and bring about change in your society. On the other hand, you have a dictation from me at the last conference, where I told you to focus on being in the now and appreciating the now, not always being so concerned about the past and the future. And you could say, well, is there not a contradiction here? But you see, my beloved, the resolution to this seeming paradox is to realize here that there is a difference between the fear-based dualistic perspective of human beings and the love-based non-dualistic perspective of the ascended masters. It is perfectly true, my beloved, that the ascended masters want to see a linear, progressive change that improves the living conditions for the people on earth. This, however, is not incompatible with the consciousness of the Buddha. I came out of nirvana in order to teach people because I also desire to see a linear progressive improvement of the living conditions on earth. The difference is that we are not attached to seeing particular changes at a particular time. We are, as we have said earlier, not so focused on a particular change because our overall goal is to raise the consciousness of our undescended brothers and sisters so that you can begin to become more conscious of the process of co-creation. So you see, my beloved, I am not telling you to not care about what happens in the future. I am not telling you to ignore what happened in the past, because you need to be aware of what happened in the past in order to understand the mechanisms that cause certain problems, that have caused certain limitations in your society, and you need to see the underlying consciousness so you can free yourself from it and help other people be free of it. So when I am telling you to focus more on being in the now, I am not saying that you should force your mind to ignore the past, force your mind to ignore the future. I am telling you to overcome the wounds you had in the past, whereby you overcome your attachment to the past, so that the past cannot pull you into these reactionary patterns that actually prevent you from, number one, enjoying the moment, number two, being free to make a decision to change the course of your life for the future. I am also telling you to resolve your psychology so that you are not trapped in a pattern where you are constantly looking to get away from the present moment into some imaginable future that you think will be better. You are, in other words, I'm telling you to not strive towards the future in order to escape dealing with your own psychology, which is the reason why so many people get trapped in dreaming about a better future. So I am telling you to actually free yourself from this escapism of dreaming about a better future and instead focus on resolving your psychology so that you can be focused in the now, because it is only in the now that you can make the conscious choices that will actually enable you, empower you to co-create a better future. If you look at my last discourse, you will see how I gave you the example that when you are trapped in a reactionary pattern, it seems like there is only one course your life can follow. So many people are trapped in the patterns where they feel that outer circumstances have boxed them in, so that there is only one choice they can make in the present situation. The choice they make has an inevitable consequence, and it brings them to another situation where it seems like there's only one choice again they can make, and this produces another consequence. And that is what you call the sea of samsara, or the wheel of suffering, because you are constantly feeling like there's only one thing you can do. You have no options, you have no freedom of choice. And whatever you do creates a consequence that it makes your life even more stressful, gives you even more suffering, makes you feel even more boxed in. This is why, as some of the lady masters said, that many people in the Asian culture, because of the predefined roles of men and women, feel that once they have gotten married and once their initial euphoria is over, they feel like their lives are locked on a track, and they can only follow that track, and it gives them stress and it gives them suffering, but they see no way out of it. And so what I was telling you in my last discourse, is not to focus in the now as a form of escapism, but to resolve the patterns of your past and to transcend the longing for a better future, so that you are free in your psychology to see that there is never a situation where you have only one choice, one option. There is always the option to look at your reactionary patterns, change your reaction to the situation, and once you change your reaction, overcome that attachment, then you will be able to see that you have at least two choices. You may not have unlimited choices, but you have an alternative to what you previously considered the only choice. And when you choose that alternative, you may still create consequences, but they will not be as severe or as limiting as previously. And this means that in your new situation, you can again look at your reactions, and when you overcome a reactionary pattern, you will see three choices in your new situation. And as you choose the highest of those choices, you will bring yourself in a situation where now you have more choices with less severe consequences. And this is how you gradually attain the freedom where you see that, as I said in my last discourse, you are standing in the center of an open plain and you can choose any course you want. This, my beloved, is a degree of mental freedom that you attain above the 96th level, but this is still not the same as enlightenment. Although, when you attain this degree of mental freedom, it becomes much easier to switch to the state of enlightenment, because as you attain freedom in the mind, what is it that creates this freedom? It is that you stop identifying with the mental images that your own mind had created of what the world is like and how the world limits you. And that makes it much easier to then switch to the point where you see, my beloved, as I also attempted to explain those many years ago, that everything in the world is just a phenomenon. It is an appearance. It is not a reality that is set in stone or in atoms. Everything is a product of a matrix in consciousness. That was what I attempted to explain those many years ago, but found it difficult to explain because people didn't even have the concept of consciousness or of parallel realities or different languages that I have given you in this discourse. So you see, once you realize that everything is a phenomenon, everything is an appearance that can be changed when you tune into the consciousness behind the phenomenon and work on changing the matrices in the emotional, mental, and identity realm, then you gain an entirely new perspective on life. And you can also gain an entirely new perspective on what we have told you. My beloved, what did we tell you last time? What did Saint Germain discourse on in terms of the tendency in the Asian culture to take life very seriously? He said that you will not create the golden age by working harder, but by playing more. Because co-creation is an act of playfulness, not an act of taking life so seriously that you want to control every aspect of life. So, we have in previous Ascended Master organizations seen this clear tendency that the students used our teachings to suddenly begin to take life and the spiritual path and themselves very seriously. They suddenly saw that there is a potential to create a much better age in the world. Or in some previous organizations where they were still trapped in dualistic thinking, they thought that the goal of being an Ascended Master student was to prevent some major calamity, such as a nuclear war. And so they got so focused on how serious it was that the world could face this calamity, and they were the only ones who could prevent it, and therefore they needed to take this task so seriously that they needed to decree all of the time, and they needed to behave according to a very strict code. And my beloved, it got to the point where all joy was squeezed out of their lives. And you could safely see that they were much more happy and joyful before they entered an Ascended Master teaching than after. And many of these people had relatives who could see this and who attempted to tell them this, but the people would not even listen to it because they were so serious about saving the world for Saint Germain. And so, my beloved, we of course do not desire to see you repeat those patterns. And that is why we have attempted to give you, perhaps even between the lines of our words, but I have attempted in this discourse to be fairly direct in my words. And so, what I desire you to see is that it is possible to switch the mind where you realize that naturally we of the Ascended Masters want you to make the calls, we want you to raise your consciousness, and we do see you as very key to improving life in your society, because you can make the calls that gives us the authority to remove some of these dark forces and dark energies that will help other people awaken and embrace these new ideas. So you are important to us. But my beloved, precisely because you are important to us, we do not want you to be burdened or stressed out by this. We want you to switch your minds so that you realize that this is not some duty or obligation that we are putting upon you. It is a part of your divine plan that you chose before coming into embodiment, and we do not want you to take this so seriously that there is no room for joy. We want you to actually see this as an act of playfulness. And it is not so difficult for you to switch that, although it may require a process, partly because you need to deal with a collective mindset in your part of the world that takes everything so seriously. But we want you to realize here, my beloved, that it is possible to make this shift where you are not attached to producing specific results in your society. Naturally, we have outlined some goals that we would like to see changed in Korea. Of course we do. Who does not want to see these goals, these improvements made? But we are not attached to seeing those improvements come about in a particular way at a particular time through particular people. We are always mindful of free will. In other words, we do not want to force this upon the Korean people. We want to free them so that they can, as we have said now so many times, spontaneously awaken, and suddenly it is obvious to them that this is the next step. This is what they actually want. And so, what we want you to switch in the switch we want you to make in your minds is that your role is to make the calls that allows us to step in and do our work. And when you have made the calls, you do not need to be attached to what happens in society, what other people do. You set them free. Because we are setting people free. We are not seeking to force anyone. And so we also set you free, and we want you to set yourselves free, so that you realize that the work you are doing must not become a burden that stresses you out and prevents you from fulfilling your daily obligations in your daily life, or prevents you from enjoying your daily life. We ask you to always strive to find enjoyment in your service and in your daily life. And this is truly the Eightfold Path that I attempted to give people 2,500 years ago, but that many people could not grasp, because for them, enlightenment or the path became another obligation, another goal to be pursued. And it became a source of stress, because they either felt they were not up to the task, or they felt they were far behind, or they felt they had to work harder, or they felt that now that they had worked so hard, they were clearly above other people, and so they became prideful. And so what I'm telling you here could be expressed in a very simple way, that the spiritual path has stages. And the dark forces do not want you to take the step from one stage to the next. So for each stage of the path, they have set a trap for you. And they want you to go into that trap so that you stay at that level. And therefore, we simply give you the concept that the spiritual path can be seen as a kind of game, where at each stage you know that the dark forces have set a trap for you, so you just need to be aware and look out for the trap by looking at your own reactions, by looking at the reactions of other spiritual people and saying, oh, now I see the trap, and I am not going to put my foot there. And so when you realize this, you realize that you do not even have to take the dark forces seriously. For whereas you can come to see through their traps, they cannot. They are trapped by their own limited imagination. But you are not trapped by a limited imagination. And when you have our teachings and apply them, it is not so difficult to avoid these traps. And therefore, you can come to that point where your path is not a source of stress. It is a source of joy. And you walk the path in a joyful manner. And if you make a mistake, so what, my beloved? You have learned from that mistake, and then you just move on from there. Because you realize that there is really, as we have said before, no choice you could make that could cause you to be trapped forever. Any choice can be undone by making a more enlightened choice, a more aware choice. And so, you see here, what I would like to say as a closing remark is that enlightenment is not a stage on the path of the 144 levels of consciousness. Enlightenment is not the end goal of the Eightfold Path. Enlightenment is not a goal, it is not a concept, it is not a mental image. It is an experience of not being trapped in mental images. So the only way to ever reach enlightenment is to switch out of the mental images and allow yourself to experience. And where do you experience enlightenment? Not in the past, not in the future, only in the now. And you can experience enlightenment in any now that could ever appear to you. And so, keep these concepts in mind until there comes a now where it suddenly becomes obvious to you, and you say, now I am there. You don't even say, now I see it, because you're not seeing it as a concept that is removed from yourself. You are experiencing it as your new reality. So, my beloved, again, a long discourse that may have stretched your body's ability to sit on a hard chair. It may have stretched your emotional body's ability to avoid going into some kind of reaction to something I said. It may have stretched your mental body's capacity to keep focusing on these very tricky concepts I have thrown at you. And it may have stretched your identity body and made you wonder, well, based on what the Buddha said, who am I? What kind of being am I? And of course, my beloved, this is the ultimate challenge. Because any sense of identity you have in this world is just a mental image. And it has no ultimate reality, and you cannot take it with you into the ascended state. But of course, you do not need to let go of your sense of identity now. You let go of it in increments, and you only have that final surrender of the last aspect of your worldly identity when you are ready to ascend. For otherwise, what would keep you in the body? What would keep you focused on serving life, which is, after all, very much part of your path? Do not believe, my beloved, that the path is only about raising your level of consciousness and getting rid of the outer self. You chose to come into this world because you wanted to have certain experiences and you wanted to co-create a better world. You wanted to make a contribution to the upward progression of this world. So it is not so, my beloved, that your service to life, your expression of life, your enjoyment of life, your experiences in life are contrary to spiritual growth. That is why I said many years ago that enlightenment is the same as the unenlightened consciousness. Because when you free yourself from the concepts that make up the unenlightened consciousness and free yourself from the concept of enlightenment, then you realize that the world is not an enemy of your spiritual growth. It is the vehicle for your spiritual growth. And your path to Buddhahood was not actually hindered by you going into the lower state of consciousness, because this was part of the experience you needed in this world, and it gave you a foundation for knowing the conditions that you wanted to change as you were engaging in the process of co-creating a better world. And therefore you see that when you reach a certain stage, there are no regrets about anything you have ever done or gone through. There is the sensation of the division between what is spiritual and what is not spiritual, or even what is anti-spiritual. You suddenly begin to see that there is no phenomenon in this world that can oppose your growth, oppose your path. There is even the dark forces, even though they have a certain temporary existence, when you see them from what they are, they do not oppose your growth because they have no power over your mind when you are freed of these distinctions between what I 2,500 years ago called the pairs, but which we now call the dualistic extremes. They have no reality. They have no power. And therefore you can see worldly phenomena without seeing them through the filter of these dualistic polarities and their value judgments. And therefore you see that every aspect of your life, every aspect of the world is a vehicle for your growth, for your self-expression, for your co-creative process and ability. And so, my beloved, you may have heard the concept that to the Buddha, time is not. And you may be realizing that I could go on like this indefinitely. For it gives me great enjoyment to give you these concepts. But I also recognize that you are not yet at the point where time is not. And so, mindful of this, I will end this stream of consciousness expressed through words, and once again express my gratitude and our gratitude for this wonderful gathering of us above and you below. The Buddha I am. Gautama is my name.